If you're a longtime listener of the podcast, you likely know what this episode is about. If you're new, well, here's what's going to happen. Like you, we like to take some time at the end of the year to pause and reflect before rushing into the new year. And so every year for our season finale of The Brief, we sit down with BCA's president to reflect on the year past and ponder the year to come. We'll cover things like major news stories from Canada and around the world and the impact that those stories have on Alberta. We break down some of the key moments and challenges and policy wins from the council. And we also look ahead and give you a preview of what's to come for the next year. If you haven't met me yet, my name is Brittany Brander, and I am one of the co-hosts of The Brief. And I'm excited to share my recent interview with Adam Legge, BCA's president. We discuss everything from Alberta's representation in Ottawa to immigration to regulatory reform to affordability and everything in between. We'll celebrate some of the key wins from this past year and give you a sneak peek at some of the work you can expect from us in 2024. And if you stay to the end, we've got some great recommendations for your holiday reading lists. Please note that this is the last episode of the season, and we will be taking a break over the holiday to recharge and come back in the new year with a brand new season of business, economic, and policy stories from around Alberta and Canada. If you found this episode interesting or insightful, let us know by heading over to Apple Podcasts or Spotify and give us a quick review and a rating. Now, on to the show. Well, it's the end of 2023. We're here again, recording this recap episode. It's probably one of my favorite episodes because you and I get to spend an hour in a room talking about the year, wins, successes, triumphs, tribulations, all of that. So let's start with big picture. You talk to more CEOs than probably anyone that I know, at least. When you reflect on the year, what have you heard from them in your conversations with our member CEOs? How would they kind of characterize the year?
I would say they characterize it as a stabilizing year. We don't have the craziness of COVID. We don't have the craziness of the COVID recovery side, the reopenings and things. So it's sort of that first full year because we were still in some COVID restrictions and things in 2022. So 23 is the first full year of that we don't have any of those things. So there's a better sense of stability. There's a better sense of what some of the life and world looks like post-COVID, but still some really uncertain economic conditions that are very much born in the post-COVID time. So all of the inflation issues, all of the supply chain issues, all of the interest rate issues. So there's still some uncertainty that's tied to those economic conditions, and we're also seeing now continued federal public policy affecting really anything that touches climate. And so still lots of areas like oil and gas, agriculture, power sector, all of those have these looming clouds and uncertainty around their businesses with respect to policy. But overall, I'd say the business sentiment is much improved from the depths of COVID, but it has come down from some of those earlier times this year when people thought that we were going to be going gangbusters on all fronts. So there's some tempering of it. So it's kind of done this bit of a roller coaster from COVID into the first full year of COVID, post-COVID, and tempering some of the expectations we thought.
Right. What's keeping them up at night right now?
I would say the biggest pieces are first government policy, largely tied to emissions, but we're also seeing public policy around artificial intelligence and technology, so that has a lot of implications for our technology members. Geopolitical issues, what's going on in the Ukraine now, well into close to 2 years of battle there, what's happened recently in Israel and Palestine, so what that's doing, some of the major macroeconomic conditions, what's that doing to resources, what's that doing to the outlook for demand internationally, what's that doing with respect to how we're seeing different countries aligning with each other in terms of a post, as Eurasia Group calls it, a G0 world. Where are people aligning? We're seeing China opening up better relations with the U.S. So there's a lot of uncertainty around the geopolitical side. And then finally, sort of Canada's place in the world. We have had a couple of countries come to our shores asking for our resources, particularly in light of the Ukraine situation and people getting off of Russia and their resource base, but we sent them home generally empty-handed. We have a very long-term hydrogen deal with Germany, but in terms of our existing resource base that's being exported, whether it's oil, natural gas, nothing of significance there. We've been left out of some major global initiatives, the AUKUS group, which around defense, which is including the US and Australia and the UK. Canada is not there. We just don't have a place at the table. And I think that's really worrying a lot of Canadian business leaders in terms of where we are and our power and our influence and our significance on the global stage.
Totally. When you yourself, because you're a respected and renowned leader in your own right.
It's debatable.
Which I think the humility might be a mark of an actual true leader. So when you look back on 2023 and think about, what's changed, what's not changed, what were some of those key defining moments for you? News stories, policy announcement, even BCA moments. What do you feel really defined this year?
Yeah. In terms of what's not changed, I would say just the challenges with government policy. That always continues to be an ongoing challenge, particularly with respect to climate and resource-related policy. Underscoring Canada's challenged record of getting things done. We're still in the midst doing some very good work on this topic, but we're still struggling on a regulatory approvals and permitting basis. I think a couple of events this year underscored Canada's challenge of being a global player, and those were the port strikes we had in Vancouver and Montreal. Vancouver was shut down for 2 weeks. We just cannot afford to be a country that is beholden to labor disruption that then has our product. We are largely an export-oriented country, and we cannot afford to have our export supply chain just grind to a halt.
Totally.
So we need to do better there. We need to figure out as a nation, how do we keep our products and services moving? What's changed a bit more than we would have thought this year? Obviously, the economy continues to go through its challenges with respect to interest rates. We're now hopefully at the highest of interest rate increases we're going to see from the Bank of Canada. And Hopefully.
Cross your fingers. Hope to die.
Cross your fingers. I'm optimistic that we have hit the peak, simply because I think from the GDP numbers are not all that strong. Labor market has cooled, and some of the inflation numbers have really come down from the peaks. We're not quite to where the bank wants us to be.
All signs that interest rates would be working, correct?
They're generally working, but even still, from the very earliest signs of the interest rate increases, which were sort of middle of last year, it takes 12 to 24 months for those. So I think we're still going to feel the effects of the interest rate increases probably for another year at least. But with the looming mortgage renewals coming in the next sort of 24 months, I don't think Canada can afford to have the rates that we have right now. Interestingly, some shifting attitudes towards immigration. We've got some very aggressive targets, but we're seeing some polling data that's saying that Canadians are feeling less positive about ambitious immigration targets, particularly as you connect the tissue to housing and the shortage of housing, the price of housing. So we're seeing a very significant traditional Canadian value of welcoming people and immigration shifting a little bit because they're feeling they can't get a toehold in the housing market. They can't find housing. So we can't be letting more people in because we can't meet the demand domestically. So that's an interesting shift. I would say that the tension between Ottawa and the provinces has ratcheted up to a level I haven't seen in many years. And we're seeing, again, that very much oriented around the climate policy side. Some of the moves that Saskatchewan has made around not collecting the carbon tax associated with its power sector. We're seeing Premier Smith has made some very strong declarations about what Alberta will and will not permit, and I think that's very important to define our space in terms of jurisdictional and constitutional rights. So we're seeing some increased tension there that is always there, but is at a higher level than I've seen in many years.
Really just amplified.
Amplified, exactly. Yeah. It's very, very polarized right now. And then in terms of some of the big wins for our organization, we had our One Alberta, One Canada
that was huge.
Delegation
very exciting.
To Ottawa. It was very exciting. 50 executives went to Ottawa, all from Alberta, and talking about the Alberta that they may not think exists, but does. Some of the new things and innovative and exciting things happening in Alberta. Talking about some critical public policy issues around things like labor and immigration and clean electricity regulations, and a major 400-person reception that we had on Parliament Hill with the Prime Minister as a speaker there.
I also think it's quite extraordinary where you have, more than 4 dozen individual people, companies from a variety of sectors going with kind of a unified message. I think that's in and of itself quite extraordinary. As a communicator, I find that really an achievement all on its own, getting so many people with disparate companies and sectors and policy ideas to say, we're here for this reason and this reason. I think that was quite an extraordinary achievement.
Yeah, it was a very exciting thing. It was quite a piece of work to do and plan and launch and execute. It was a lot of work, but I think a really important piece for us to get the message of Alberta to Ottawa and to federal decision makers, because there are still a very significant number of looming stereotypes about what happens in Alberta, what Albertans are like, and what Alberta priorities are.
Yeah.
So we were very excited to do that project. And as you say, we had everybody from the airline sector, oil and gas sector, manufacturing sector, construction sector, financial market sector. It was a very diverse group, but we were all aligned around a common message of Alberta is not what you think it is.
Do you think that we really shifted the needle in Ottawa and how folks in Ottawa actually see Alberta and everything that we represent and everything that we are? And did they really hear this story that we were trying to tell?
Time will tell. I think we definitely met some people we hadn't met before. We're always telling the Alberta story whenever we go to Ottawa, but I think this time hearing it from such a diverse audience, hearing it from a spectrum of people and business leaders from a variety of different industries, hearing it perhaps for the first time or hearing it for the 10th time, it is one of those things that is going to take repeated visits, and whether that's the whole delegation or whether that's just BCA in terms of some of the work we do. But I think it began to chip away at some of the stereotypes of what people thought Alberta might be. So,
love it.
And then very quickly, our prosperity-driven immigration project, our major paper released in the fall around When More Is Not Enough, and a few follow-on papers. Have been a tremendous project that we're working on. We'll continue into 2024. And then very excited that we received 2 awards for our Define the Decade 10-year vision.
Very exciting.
Yeah, exactly, from Economic Developers of Alberta. So very proud of that work. So
as you should be. So continuing on our reflections theme, any lessons or insights that you have learned this year just about maybe the policy environment that we find ourselves in? I know you talked about polarization. Mm-hmm. Any lessons or insights on how we move forward from that, or the economic environment, any social expectations on leaders? Just broadly, what have you learned about just public policy and business's role in society over the last year?
I would say that it was interesting to see how the priorities of Canadians shifted over 2023. I think for a long time, Canadians have very much been supportive of climate policy and environmental action. But I think we're now seeing that a shift because higher order needs are taking precedence. Particularly affordability rose to the top of the issue pile for Canadians this year. And so the sentiment towards climate has shifted, and people are now viewing affordability, the ability to afford a house or to rent, has taken number one spot. Not that the climate isn't important, but I think they've realized that what is most important is a house and a roof over their heads. And something we've been telling the federal government for quite some time was that there's 2 ways you can achieve things. You can pick between good, fast, and cheap. You can pick 2, but you can't have all 3. And I think for too long, federal narratives were that you can have all 3, and I think this year was the year that proved out you can't.
Right.
And we saw pushback in terms of, Atlantic Canada got their own carve-out with respect to the carbon tax, and that was largely a reflection of the cheap side of things. We can't afford the carbon tax on this kind of heating oil. And so we're really seeing that narrative shift, and I think it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out in the next 12, 24 months in terms of what are the policy priorities and choices the federal government makes in terms of how they prioritize policy, how they prioritize attention and time in terms of the issues for Canadians, because I think housing is and affordability has just become the number one issue that's sort of crowding out a lot of the other things we've been doing in the past couple of years. And that good, cheap, and fast, we need to really have that conversation as a country about which 2 are we going to pick and what's the third we're going to put to the side. And I would say just the sort of the continued regionalized bias of public policy. We're recording this on a date where we're expecting within the next week or so the oil and gas emissions cap to come down. And as much as it is an industry initiative, it really does regionally affect a very small portion of the country. And we are sitting in one of those affected regions to some degree on the east coast of Newfoundland as well. But there's just the continued regionalized bias in terms of the public policy environment that we hope we continue to chip away. The Mission Ottawa, I think, is one of those initiatives that helps with sharing the story. But that is definitely something that we're continuing to monitor and see, that we try and encourage governments to take a very standardized approach to public policy when it comes to making sure that all Canadians are better off at the end of the day, but reflecting the regionalized nature. For example, the clean electricity regulations, that the whole country, a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't necessarily fit. So we need to reflect region on a biased way that is positive for the prosperity and the well-being of Canadians, as opposed to being more punitive. Yeah,
equitable policy for different regions. Absolutely. So policy changes often happen very incrementally, very slowly, and that can be sometimes frustrating. However, we saw some very clear movement on some pretty key files this year. Can you talk to me a little bit more about some of the specific wins that we can celebrate?
Yeah, there's probably about 4 or 5 this year that I think we've really been highly engaged in. The first one, which was a pretty momentous decision from the Supreme Court of Canada on Bill C-69.
Yeah.
The government of Alberta took the federal government to court in terms of its constitutionality of the Impact Assessment Act and Bill C-69. We were an intervener with the government of Alberta, arguing that elements of the act were unconstitutional. And in the fall, the Supreme Court decided that there are significant portions of Bill C-69 that are unconstitutional. They stray too far into the territory of provincial jurisdiction, and it needs a rework. And so that was a big piece in terms of our involvement. We had a number of members that we worked with to get our case crafted by a great team at Osler and put in front of the Supreme Court as an intervener. So very proud of that, and working with the government to continue to make sure that the next versions, because they've alluded to the fact that it just needs a little tweak here and there. We would argue otherwise, that it is not just a little tweak. It does need some significant work. And we don't want to see is that little tweaks then end up in another legal action that then takes, again, years to resolve. And so we have to stop determining public policy in this country through Supreme Court of Canada decisions. That's just not productive. That's not competitive. Investment will go elsewhere. That will be looked at as a country that just keeps using the courts as a way of deciding its public policy. And so let's do it right the first time. Let's engage parties and let's do it thoughtfully. We took on the task of trying to help improve the regulatory approvals environment. Minister Wilkinson, back in late 2022, we spoke to him and said, Minister, look, we have ambitious targets as a country, but our own regulatory approval system will get in the way of achieving it. So we're kind of our own worst enemy in this case. He says, yes, I know. We need to fix some things. So if you have any ideas, let us know. So we struck a task force with a number of members who've gone through these processes and developed a report called Future Unbuilt, which really says, ideally, it's a rebuild of Bill C-69, but in the case that we can't do that, here are a variety of areas that we want to see fix. And it really buckets into 3 Ps: process, participation, and predictability. And we did a big release of that in June, brought a number of our task force members and met with senior government officials, including the clerk. And I'm proud to say that as of this recording, 2 days from now, I'm heading to Ottawa to present to the Ministerial Working Group on Regulatory Reform. That's a big deal. It is a big deal for a few reasons. One is I don't think it would have been struck without the pressure of our voice asking for regulatory reform, which was announced in Budget 23. And secondly, to my knowledge, we're the only business group in the country being afforded the opportunity to present to the Ministerial Working Group. So I think a huge testament to the work we've done there on regulatory reform. So I'm very excited to see the changes that come through and hope that they take our guidance on that. Very exciting. Congratulations. Oh, thank you. Team effort for sure. And then immigration, we're continuing to advance some of the work there in terms of making sure it's, as I say, prosperity driven is the title of our work, so that the system is built to ensure that the immigrants that come to Canada, A, are the right ones for our economy now and in the future, B, have a better process and a better ability to get into the country and have their credentials recognized and be settled and build a life here in Canada, so that we don't miss on the promise that is Canada. So very excited on that work. It's going to be, I think, pretty groundbreaking. When we were in Ottawa for the One Alberta, One Canada mission, heard some very strong and positive commentary from the Prime Minister, which is something you don't often hear, him say good things about Alberta. But, to paraphrase what he said was, there isn't anything we do in this country in terms of moving forward and being a leader without Alberta at the forefront of that. And he made some acknowledgements of the great work done by Pathways Alliance for Net Zero, which is a tremendous recognition for the work that Alberta companies are doing and leading the way. And then finally, I'd say one of the ones that part and parcel of that Future Unbuilt is that we've long been encouraging the federal government to do a federal Indigenous loan guarantee program. And we're starting to see narrative around that. It was in the fall economic statement that they will have something in Budget 24 associated with that. The Canadian Infrastructure Bank has now opened up some of their loan programs to Indigenous groups. We still think there are too many constraints on that, but I think we're beginning to see progress. And that's, again, another message we'll share with the Ministerial Working Group when I'm there in Ottawa in 2 days from now. So a variety of, I think, some great outcomes for the work being done by the Council on behalf of our members, and really showing that we're doing deep, meaningful work and engagement while they're continuing to grow and build their companies. Yeah, I mean, at the beginning, you talked about how this is more of a stable year. And I was thinking a little bit about BCA's own kind of life since we started, and we haven't really had a stable year since we started, because we started in 2019 and then COVID recovery, more COVID recovery, and then this has kind of been the first year where we've, I think, been able to do the work that we were always designed to do. But I think COVID gave us like that opportunity to really build those relationships with governments and show what we could do. So, I mean, I think these
5 things you mentioned are excellent. Just the people that we get to talk to, not just our members, but government as well. And to see the actual impact of some of this work is pretty crazy.
Yeah, I'm very proud of the work we do, and I think that we forged a team under very adverse circumstances, and really had to zero in on the public policy issues that are of the most importance to our members. But it also enabled us to say, let's do a few things really well and hone in on those versus trying to spread ourselves too thin. And I think that pays dividends in terms of the depth and the rigor and the quality of the work that we've got.
So looking forward, when we sit here for our 2024 recap podcast, what issues do you think will have defined the year? So looking crystal ball.
I think there's sort of 2 categories. One is that, broadly speaking, I think affordability and the economy will continue to be some of the main issues in the country. I think for us in public policy work, we're going to still see climate a major public policy focus. We'll see the Canada Gazette 2 version of the clean electricity regulations. We'll likely still be tackling the oil and gas emissions cap, which will come in a Gazette version sometime next year. We will, I think, still be talking about and rolling out our immigration work. So there's still lots to be happening on that front. And I think we'll be looking at what is Alberta as a bright spot in the national economic picture, and what are the opportunities and potential that Alberta continues to hold. It's about how do you continue to advance the define the decade work that we did 2 years ago, and really make sure we're setting ourselves up for a long-term trajectory. So I think those are the critical issues that I believe will be addressing, but as an economist and research person, I've come to realize that something will come out of left field and just hit you right between the eyes, and you'll be doing something new and unexpected.
Right.
Yeah.
Where is your optimism? Where do you see the opportunities for next year?
I mean, I'm remarkably excited about where Alberta is now, and I was just actually thinking I want to do like a LinkedIn post in the next day or two, because if you look at the past couple of weeks in Alberta, we have hit our methane targets earlier than planned. We have just announced the Alberta Carbon Incentive Program, which will enable the Alberta portion for CCUS investment tax credits. We have just been named, Calgary and Edmonton, in some of the clean growth top centers in the world to invest and start a business. Our population growth is record-setting.
Yeah.
Our economy is being viewed by most economics departments to be the right spot in the country. I mean, who wouldn't want the convergence of those realities and that performance? So when we did define the decade, it was in a moment of, were people thinking our Alberta's best days behind us? I still am a firm believer that our best days are ahead of us, and some of the things we're seeing, some of the moves that the province is making, some of the investments that business is making are proof positive. We saw that the Dow final investment decision, FID, made by the board and announced last week, where we're going to see Canada's first net zero petrochemical facility in the industrial heartland around the Edmonton region. So we keep racking up the wins. Alberta's on a roll. Our best days are ahead of us, and so I'm excited to see what 24 brings in that regard, because we're always going to have bumps along the way. But when I look at the opportunities in energy, I look at the opportunities in agriculture, I look at the opportunities in health and wellness, I look at the opportunities in artificial intelligence. They are so massive and so robust for Alberta that's what gets me excited.
I love that. What do you think we're not talking nearly enough about right now that should maybe be more on the public agenda next year?
2 topics that I think are ones that aren't likely to be talked about at the Tim Hortons in Rimbey, Alberta, but I think are really important. One is Canada's global reputation and what we're being left out of in terms of the major working groups on everything from intelligence to defense to resources. We're just not at the major table. So I think we need to be talking more about why are we not there and what's it going to take for us to get to those tables. And secondly, something that Canada has been talking about for decades, which is productivity. And we are really lagging in that. We are behind the United States. We are not investing in the technologies that need to be enhancing our productivity. We have a demographic reality that it is incontrovertible. We have an aging population. There are going to be fewer people paying the bills for health care, et cetera, as we have a higher dependency ratio coming. So therefore, you need higher productivity to generate more wealth and prosperity through a fewer number of people. But we just can't seem to crack the nut. And I think it's a variety of issues. It's everything from our protection of certain industries like banking and supply chain protected industries, to our lack of incentives around some of the investment in innovative machinery and equipment. And then finally, I think it's our lack of competitiveness around the overall tax regime in Canada. That we've been many organizations pushing for review of the Canada Tax Code to be more competitive, and we just aren't opening that door. So I until we tackle a variety of those things, we're still going to be talking about lagging productivity for many years and decades going forward.
What's on the horizon for BCA next year? Can you give us a little preview?
Yeah, continued work on prosperity-driven immigration. We've got a couple more papers and a bit of a launch to happen in probably late Q1, early Q2.
Yeah.
We want to build off Define the Decade and look at, we're coming up close to Alberta's 5 million people. Are we ready? Are we ready with respect to health? Are we ready with respect to transportation infrastructure? Are we ready with respect to housing, talent, skills, all those kinds of things? So a bit of not a new version of Define the Decade, but some kind of discrete pieces and studies on are we ready across a variety of different things that are going to make sure we're competitive. We're going to be doing some work on how do we de-risk investment in emissions reduction across whether it's the resource sector or the power sector. Those are some critical things that we know that a lot of these technologies are early stage. They're very expensive. They're high risk. So what can Alberta do to de-risk so we can reduce emissions, which is an incredibly important objective. And finally, we'll continue our pounding on the drum of regulatory reform. We expect to see something in Budget 24 federally that will tackle some of the challenges, but we need to be continually advocating for regulatory reform work in the country. And so those are what we have on the docket now for 24, and we'll see what comes down the pipe, because there most definitely will be something that comes along we weren't anticipating.
If we can get one thing right as a country next year, what would you like to see it be?
Short term, I would say climate policy. Medium term, I would say regulatory reform. And long term, I'd say productivity.
Love it. I love a good matrix. Just a few final questions to close off our recap. Next year, we as a council will celebrate 5 years. That's a significant milestone. What do you think is one lesson that you've learned from working with fellow chief executives and presidents and premiers and prime ministers? What's one lesson about leadership that you have learned from the people that you've worked with?
It's hard to say one thing.
Or 3 things.
Probably around 3, I would say. Yeah, I'm very privileged to be able to spend time with not only the CEO members that we have, but elected officials, premiers, ministers, prime minister, et cetera. One of the things that really stood out is that timing is everything, and particularly in the work that we do. If we're trying to advocate for a position that really isn't at the crux of public opinion and isn't in the crux of government's crosshairs, it's great. Thanks for coming on to the next meeting. And so timing in terms of our work, our communication, our advocacy, lining up with government priorities and the initiatives is so critical. Secondly, something I've learned really and seen very effectively by a number of our members when they go to Ottawa, when they speak with government, is just the crystal clear communication of what is the problem, what is the solution, in a way that can be interpreted by the recipient as meaningful and helpful to them. We talk a lot in Alberta about some of the challenges we face, but often it is from a way in which we interpret the situation, the challenge, or which we think is the issue. But until we can actually frame it in a way that's usable and helpful to our recipients, that's when you've really nailed it. And oftentimes we've really struggled, particularly in the oil and gas sector, about our safety records and our contribution to national GDP. Often those just sort of fall on deaf ears, we found. So we need to be framing things around the priorities of Canadians, which then drive priorities of elected officials. So crystal clear communication. I would say that policy needs to be better co-created in this country. It's often done in Ottawa in a vacuum. And many folks in Ottawa will acknowledge that they're feeling very time pressured to get so many things done and into the queue that they don't spend as much time co-creating. And I think what we need to do is a better job of doing drafts and reviews and things like that before they get published in things like Canada Gazette 1. So we're seeing a need to better co-create and collaborate, opening up and sharing data models, opening up and sharing testing ideas, bouncing ideas through working groups and task forces. I think that's the future, and we need to be doing that with industry, with Indigenous leaders, with government, all coming together to try and make these things stronger. So I'd say those are probably the 3 things that jump out for me this year from my learnings and takeaways and really seeing great things happen.
Love it. What advice would you have for aspiring leaders based on everything that you learned?
Timing is everything. Know exactly what you're trying to communicate from the perspective of the recipient. Focus on accountability and results and performance, and take care of your team.
Love it. Yeah. Love it. 2 final questions. One fun, one more reflective. The fun one first. What are you reading right now? And what book would you recommend for a bit of holiday reading?
What am I reading right now? I am just finished one book, and now I'm on to a new one. It's called The Constitution of Knowledge. I'm not, to be honest, very sure whether I like it or not. So it's really about how the truths and fake news and all these sorts of things and the sources of information, how we drive information, how we perceive information. I'll be totally honest, I'm not sure I like it yet. So it's a bit of a question mark looming over that one. But what would I recommend for a bit of holiday reading, for a bit of an escape that I just recently tore through, is a book called Freezing Order by Bill Browder. It's his second book. The first one he wrote was called Red Notice. He is the American investment banker that worked in Russia and was then had to relocate when Putin came to power, and his lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, was murdered by the Putin regime, and which created the Magnitsky Act in many different countries, which enables countries to freeze the assets of various actors. And this book is a continuation of some of the challenges he's faced with, frankly, Russian assets going after him and his family, in terms of his continued efforts to try and hold those accountable for Sergei Magnitsky's murder. I think I read it in like a day. It read like a fast-paced spy novel. The scary thing is it's real. So I highly recommend any of you that are interested in some of the Russia dynamics and spy-type novels. This one was absolutely fantastic.
That sounds fascinating.
I'd also recommend, I read one of Adam Schultz. He's a bit of a popular Canadian author right now. I read his first book about his journey through northern Canada, amazingly paddling upstream for much of the way. It seemed like a pretty incredible solo journey and quite a tale. Interestingly, I read Matthew Perry's biography, sadly, before he passed away, and may he definitely rest in peace. What a tragic story of addiction, and remarkable actor and Canadian. Looking forward to reading a book we just gifted to all of our members called The Coming Wave, which is about technology and artificial intelligence, one that is on the FP Top Business Books of the Year shortlist, and I think pretty much every business book reading list I've seen. So I haven't read it yet, but I'm looking forward to tucking into that one over the holidays.
Final thought, insight that you would like to leave our listeners with as we close out the year?
First and foremost, gratitude for our members and everything they've given to us to help do the work that we do. We exist because of them. We exist to help support their businesses and ultimately for making life better for all Albertans. So all of the investment they've made in the organization, the time they've given us in terms of task forces and meetings and roundtables, and then also just a gratitude to everybody who listens and takes interest in these issues, because if we aren't talking about these issues, if we aren't raising them with our politicians, our elected officials, or in the conversation, the coffee table and the dining table, we aren't going to tackle what I think are the most critical and pressing issues of the day. We definitely have challenges as a country in terms of affordability and housing and reconciliation. There are a variety of things that most of us run our daily lives without understanding some of the bigger issues that ultimately affect whether we can afford a home, whether we can get a job or get a promotion or grow our company or take a new job because that company's grown and expanded. All of these things are intertied and intertwined together. And so having more conversations at dining room tables around some of these issues about the future of this province, the future of the country, and the role we want it to play. I know probably is a bit of a heavy Christmas dinner conversation, but something we do hope that more people take on is having those collective discussions of where do we want to go, because the potential for this province, the potential for this country are incredible. There's a define the decade aspect of the province and for the country, and so if we can rally behind those ambitions and say that our best days as a province and a country are still ahead of us, and how do we chart that together, that would be, I think, probably one of the best times spent over some Christmas cheer that I can think of. So,
well, that's a great place to leave it. Thank you so much, Adam.
Thanks, Britt.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of The Brief, an Alberta Better podcast series. This podcast is a production of the Business Council of Alberta, and you can learn more about us at businesscouncilab.com, and we'd love to connect with you on social media, so give us a follow at BizCouncilAB on Twitter, LinkedIn, TikTok, and YouTube. And finally, don't forget to subscribe and rate the show and give us a quick review. Your support helps us to keep making more of these episodes. Alberta Better is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. New episodes drop every other Tuesday. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in January 2024 with a brand new season. Happy holidays and Happy New Year.